Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We will get started a few minutes after 2 Eastern. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We will be starting shortly. I appreciate you all being ahead of time. Thank you so much for being here. Hi, everyone. Welcome once again. We will be starting shortly. Awesome. All right. All right. Great. I hope everyone can hear me. Welcome once again. We will be starting shortly. This is a webinar, a little bit different than our previous DID network program, so I appreciate you all being here. Unfortunately, Fortunately and unfortunately, we cannot see your beautiful faces, but I do welcome you to join us via the chat feature to introduce yourselves. And also, we will open up the chat a little bit after the presentation today, where you can ask your questions. As you are joining, please feel free to share with us where you are calling from, also what organization you are joining us with, and your name and title. Some of you may be able to see it all in the chat. Not 100% sure. This is our first time using the webinar feature, but feel free to introduce yourselves via the Q&A or chat feature so we know who you are. And we'll be starting shortly. Okay, chat is disabled. Thank you so much. But you can send me via Q&A. That's totally fine. I appreciate that for our records. Great. So with that, again, feel free to tell us who you are via the Q&A feature for our personal records. I do want to take this time to, again, thank you so much for being here, for your passion, for your willingness to continue this work. And first and foremost, happy Black History Month to all of you. Today, we are going to learn and explore a little bit more about anti-racist design. So obviously you see our guest speaker here, Justin Walker, which I will introduce him formally. And also to let you know that we are opening this discussion up at the end of his presentation. So please stay tuned. At the end of his presentation, we will be taking a lot of your questions through the Q&A to make sure that we open up this dialogue. Again, first time we're using our webinar feature. This is usually a more interactive conversation, but we've had so much interest and we're so grateful for that. So again, feel free to join us via the chat at the end of his presentation. So with that said, please join me in welcoming Justin Walker from ChiByDesign. Justin Walker is a strategist and designer with a primary focus on the practices of anti-racist design, code design, and systems design. As his work and interests lie at the intersection of community-led and business design, he is constantly exploring and analyzing complex systems to understand and address societal problems. Through Justin's experience as a management consultant, he has led change and program management and digital transformation initiatives for Fortune 500 corporations across several industries. Justin's corporate experience, combined with his design practice, allows him to solve problems creatively and build the structures for successful implementation. So again, please join me in welcoming Justin Walker of ChiByDesign. Justin, I believe you're muted.
Hey, thanks.
There we go.
Thank you. Hey, everyone. Happy Black History Month. I'm glad you all were able to join us today. Let me share my screen here. So I'm going to do a bit of talking today, but I'm looking forward to the Q&A here at the end. So I'm looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts and questions here. I'm glad that there was so much interest around anti-racist design. I think it's kind of fitting that we're gonna hear talking about anti-racist design today during Black History Month. Kind of knowing that we celebrate Black History Month, kind of separating it out in large part because of racism. And so kind of racism has created the need for a Black History Month. So thank you all for joining. You heard kind of I guess a bit of more of a professional intro just now, but I wanted to share something, I guess a little bit more personal, so you can kind of get a sense or some context around who I am and kind of why I do the work that I do. So I was born and raised in Pontiac, Michigan, which is about 15 minutes north of 15 to 20 minutes north of Detroit. So some people know it because the Detroit Lions and the Pistons played there for years. I think it was also the home of the 1994 World Cup. If you follow soccer, but it's a small suburb, mostly Black at the time, of Detroit. So my mother was a teacher. My father was the executive director of the Silverdome where the Lions played, and he was also a Baptist preacher. And so I also grew up with 4 amazing grandparents who migrated from the South, so from Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana during the Great Migration, which was a period that many Black folks kind of migrated up from the South in the kind of 40s, 50s, and 60s. So I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, and they shared stories with me and my twin brother, some pretty horrific of the racism that them and their families faced in the South. And so at an early age, I kind of began to understand the impact of racism, and started to identify racism and kind of the outcomes of that to some degree. So I'll share kind of a quick story that my grandfather shared with us once. So when he was young, he had to walk very long distances to school down in Louisiana because there were no buses for Black children. And so he would walk along the side of the road every day, and every day the buses would pass by full of the white children who were able to ride the buses. And then they would throw rotten eggs at him and the other Black children. And so not only did he have to kind of walk to school, but once he got there, he smelled like rotten eggs, and was expected to kind of learn and interact in the same way as children typically interact in school and learn, until one day, I guess he brought a brick with him and threw it through the window of one of the school buses as they were throwing rotten eggs. And based on his story, some of that stopped after that day. But I wanted to share that story because I think it touches on kind of a few things, kind of racist experiences. So kind of racism at the experience level for individuals, kind of structural and systemic racism, and then kind of Black resistance and fighting against racism in that moment, even as a small child. So I've been practicing anti-racist design now at ChiByDesign for about 3 years. And so I'll kind of talk some about our approach to anti-racism. And so ChiByDesign, so we research, we identify, understand racism in systems and design interventions to address it. And so I guess at a high level, that's a very high level, that's what we do. But for us, there are kind of 3 components or practices that have to be used when practicing anti-racist design. And so we're human-centered. So we center people in the work that we do. We try our best to understand what they want, what folks need. However, we're not unbiased in our approach like we are typically taught in design school or when we're being trained to be designers. We say that we are biased in favor of those who are experiencing or have experienced racism. And so for us, that is how we are human-centered. And so we also think in systems, right? So we're not just trying to understand and pull apart kind of racist experiences. So we try to understand the root cause of racist outcomes and root causes that are creating those experiences, and how they're impacted by the system that we're working in, but also impacted by adjacent systems. All right, so if we're working in child welfare, for example, we're not only focusing on child welfare, we're looking at education system, we're looking at health, to understand how those systems are interacting together to create racist outcomes. And then third, we're trauma responsive in our approach. And so, as you all likely know, racism causes trauma. And many of the folks that we work with have experienced trauma due to racism and other experiences that they've had, right? And so we try to be mindful of that and try to mitigate any kind of re-traumatization that might happen in their work with us. And then we also try to focus as much as we can on healing throughout the process and in the interventions that we design. And so we have these three components, but then you kind of see this kind of through lines going across the screen here of co-design. So co-design is kind of the process that we use in all of the work that we do. And so we design with folks, not for. And so we know that we don't have the answers as designers. We haven't experienced things in the same context as the folks who we're trying to design with. And so all of the work that we do, all the engagements that we do, we work with folks' lived experiences in the engagements that we work in. Okay, so now let's get into racism here. So how do we define racism? So I know you all likely know that there are many definitions of racism. So each kind of dictionary has its own definition of racism. Many organizations have their own definitions of racism. And many of them are similar, but many of them are very different. But in doing this work, it was important for us to have kind of a common base to work from as a team and as an organization. And so we've defined racism, and this is the definition that we work from. And so racism is a tool used for the discrimination, the violence, oppression, and exploitation of a group, actualized through beliefs, interactions, policies, and practices based on race to maintain a perceived social, racial hierarchy and economic superiority. So we say that racism is a tool, right? And so racism and race, for that matter, were created as tools for specific purposes. And so racism is a tool that's used to oppress. It's a tool that's used to exploit. It's used to maintain hierarchy and economic superiority here. Like when you think of all those things together, it's used to kind of to take power and to maintain power for certain folks, right? And so this is the definition that we use in the work that we do. And so now, you know, what does racism look like in real life? What does it look like on a daily, right? And so as anti-racist designers, we know and understand that racism is all around us. But I wanted to spend some time here because I know that sometimes it can be hard for folks to identify racism or see the ways that it's showing up all around us. So here's an example. So this is Jones Bridge. It was built by Robert Moses, who was an urban planner in New York. And he designed a lot of the parkways and highways that were built in New York around 20s and on. And so, you know, he was a fairly influential person in New York, and some say that he was more influential at points than even the mayor of New York or even the governor of the state of New York. One of his kind of greatest achievements was Jones Beach State Park, and so he built Jones Beach State Park. But to get there, people had to drive through underpasses like the one that you see on the screen. And at the time, the predominant kind of mode of transportation for people of color was the bus. Buses couldn't drive through there. And so the number of people of color going through the underpass and getting to the beach was very limited. And so now some folks believe that, or many folks believe that that was done on purpose, that the underpass was purposefully constructed at a height that buses couldn't pass through, so people of color could not get to the beach. But some people believe that it wasn't on purpose, but that it was kind of an unintended consequence. So there's a lot of debate around that. But kind of whether or not it was intentional, we can see here that that the outcome was that there were much fewer Black folks at the beach, even years later. And so this is a tally that's done years after the underpass was built. That shows on the left the number of white people at the beach on a given day and the number of Black folks at the beach on a given day. And so I'm showing this because it's important to look at outcomes when we're trying to identify racism. And so this is a racist outcome. So there may be other contributing factors to why there are so few Black folks going to the beach, but this bridge was definitely an enabler of this racist outcome, right? And so when we're identifying racism, we look at the outcomes, and then we identify the things that are enabling those racist outcomes. And I like this example because it shows kind of how a public infrastructure can enable racism, right? And so there are many kind of racist infrastructures that exist across the country. When we look at many highways that were built to kind of dismantle or separate Black communities and things of that nature. And so I like this example because it kind of shows a kind of a more tangible way that racism shows up and exists in ways that we might not even notice. So I'll show a few more examples here. So this is what racism looks like as well, right? So as of 2020, the gap in life expectancy between Black and white Chicagoans, which is Chicago is where I currently reside, is 10 years. So that means that just because I'm a Black person in Chicago, right, my life expectancy is 10 years less than a white person, right? So that is most definitely a racist outcome. And there are many reasons for that. Right. And so, like I mentioned before, we see this outcome, but then we have to understand what are the things that are enabling this. What are the things that are creating this outcome? What are the systems that are working together to create this outcome? Right. Another example: the median white family had $184,000 in wealth in 2019 compared to $38,000 and $23,000 for the median Hispanic and Black families, respectively. Another racist outcome that's been driven by many years of racist policies, practices, systems, all kind of driven to this point. And a third, right? So depending on the poll, only 3 to 4.8% of designers are Black. So although Black folks in the United States design and create a lot of the culture, the design and create a lot of the things around us, they are not in the design profession, which is, I believe, one of the main reasons why we're all here today. So I definitely appreciate everyone here who is fighting to change these stats. So now we'll talk a little bit about anti-racism. And so how we define anti-racism. So there are a lot of definitions of racism. There are fewer definitions of anti-racism. But this is a definition that we use at ChiByDesign. So we say that anti-racism is an intentional, direct, and targeted actions that work to identify the ways that race has been constructed to oppress particular groups of people, decenter dominant hegemonic narratives and interests, and center those of the folks who have been oppressed instead, right? And then to dismantle and eliminate the systems of marginalization and oppression. So I'll just pause for a quick second to let folks kind of read that again on the screen. But at a high level, right? So when we're thinking about anti-racism, anti-racism requires action, right? And that's why we see intentional, direct, and targeted actions that work too. And in that vein, if we can kind of think about it in three kind of larger actions, right? We identify racism in the systems or in the context that we're working in. We acknowledge it. We acknowledge that it's there and that it needs to be addressed, and then we act. Right. So I'll kind of bring us back to the ChiByDesign approach that I shared earlier. And so we practice anti-racist design. It's human-centered with a human-centered mindset, systems thinking, trauma-responsive design through the practice of co-design. So what is anti-racist design? So anti-racist design does three things, right? So it assumes that racism is embedded in the problem that we're trying to address. It's embedded in all social systems. There's a focus on multi-level interventions. And we're working to change the paradigm that create racist experiences, right? So we're not trying to design interventions that help Black folks to kind of deal with racism or kind of circumvent racism in systems. We're trying to change the systems themselves so folks don't have to experience racism. And for us, anti-racist design has to be trauma-informed. And so we are working to kind of build an awareness and an understanding of trauma. Like I mentioned before, racism creates trauma inherently. And so we have to hold space for that trauma and for folks to kind of experience that in the ways that they do in our teams and with the folks who we may be working with. And then third, we design for healing, recovery, and growth. And so in a couple slides back, we talked about acknowledgement. And so kind of part of that healing process is that the folks, system actors that we work with, right? So, you know, those folks have to acknowledge the harm that they've caused or that the system has caused to the folks of color who have been impacted by racism. And then we talked some about systems thinking earlier, right? And so I think many of you have probably seen this kind of iceberg model. So we're looking at the kind of the top line experience or the event, the patterns of behavior that have caused it, the systemic structures that enable it, and the mental models that drive it. One thing that we also look at ChiByDesign are the economics, because economics drives everything, right? And so we work and operate under a system of capitalism, and in this system, economics drives much of what happens, if not all of what happens in systems, right? And so when we see racist outcomes, there's usually some organization, some group that is at some point financing what's driving racist outcomes. And so now, you know, we talked some about co-design. I won't spend too much time here, but co-design is really about designing with and not for people, right? And so one of the things that co-design does is it requires power sharing, right? And so I mentioned that at ChiByDesign, we bring folks onto our teams for the duration of a design engagement. So we'll bring folks on our teams, folks with lived experience, and so they have the knowledge, the deep knowledge of the issues that we're trying to design around. They have the experiences that inform what we should be doing, but sometimes they don't have the design training, and so we will train them in design, so we can all be on a level playing field as we work through the engagement, right? And so, of course, folks aren't gonna, know everything there is to know about design, but we work as a team through any of those questions and kind of any things that come up through the engagement together. So this slide gives us a kind of a quick 5 things that co-design kind of allows us to do, but it gives us better insights because, like I mentioned before, we don't have the experiences to kind of know and understand in depth the challenges that we're addressing. We're able to leverage the creativity and the expertise of the folks with lived experience and other stakeholder groups, right? And so many times we'll work on engagements we're working with folks across sectors, and so we're bringing in experts across and leaders across sectors and working with them as well. And increases the stakeholder buy-in, right? And so if you design something for someone, it's not something that they want, it's something that that's been kind of forced upon them, there's not going to be much buy-in, right? So working with folks to create things, to create the things that they actually want and need will create a better sense of buy-in there, right? And then I'll gonna skip to number 5 here, and this is around developing stronger bonds and relationships, right? You can't do this work, co-design, without developing relationships. Co-design requires by its nature that we create relationships with the folks that we're designing with, outside of just your kind of transactional, normal business relationships, right? Because you have to build up trust with folks before you can actually work with them. So almost done here. But I wanted to kind of just share this because I know that there might be some questions around the difference between human-centered design and anti-racist design. So I just wanted to kind of share this, to just kind of draw a few comparisons. So in human-centered design, the focus is on the problem and people or groups, regardless of race. Whereas anti-racist design, the work has to be race specific. We have to identify the affected groups of people within whatever context we're designing in. So that's a huge difference. Responsibility. In human-centered design, the responsibility most times is on the individual, right? And so we'll design an intervention that will help an individual to navigate through a certain experience. But at the end of the day, they're responsible for navigating through whatever they need to navigate through. We're designing something to help them to do that. Whereas anti-racist design, the responsibility is on the system and system actors, because we're designing for systems change, right? And so we're trying to change the paradigm that people live and work in so they don't have to experience racism. So in doing that, we have to the folks who work in the system and the system itself has to change. And so the responsibility is on them, not on the folks who are experiencing racism. And then outcomes here, right? So human-centered design, the outcome is generally kind of at some kind of experience level intervention, right? We're trying to help people to navigate through something or to do something better. But when we think about anti-racist design, so the interventions have to be multi-level, right? So when we think about kind of the micro, meso, and macro levels, right? And thinking about, yes, we're designing experience level interventions, but we also have to design system level interventions for change to happen. So as designers, we have to know that racism exists in whatever system and almost in every context that we're designing in. So we as designers have to do the work to identify racism, identify racist outcomes, racist interactions, and address them in the work that we're doing and the things that we design. So I know that not everybody is going to be an anti-racist designer in the way that I am. But we can all do work to better understand the impact of racism on people of color. And we can all do the work to try to incorporate a level of anti-racism in the work that we do. I love this quote, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house," from Audre Lorde. Because as designers, we can't keep using the same methods and the same frameworks that have enabled our current kind of racist and hyper-capitalist existence. Right? We can't keep using the same things that we've been using. We have to create new tools, new methods, new frameworks to really address racism in a way that creates systemic change. And that's what we are doing in ChiByDesign. So I'll open it up for questions now.
Awesome. Thank you, Justin. Really do appreciate that. And thank you so much for sharing your personal story at the beginning. I think that really, at least for me personally, it really hit home, because you sometimes don't realize that racism is, obviously we may experience it in our day-to-day, but it could be so close to home. And I think when we think about our ancestors and how they've experienced racism, and how that's different, right? Different today, but yet so similar, or it could be different today, but so similar. So I appreciate you sharing that story with us. So as we wait for questions to come in, oh, look, we already have one. What are some tangible ways we can educate our designers to ensure that they are practicing anti-racist design? It's a great question.
Ways that we can educate designers. I think one, so I guess I'll maybe start. So I think there's a few ways. I think one is we have to understand historical context. And so I think many times, and we look around the United States right now, people are trying to kind of stop the learning of history in the way that it happened, right? So we're looking at places like Florida and Texas, right? So, but I think it is it's super important to understand historical context and to understand the ways in which folks have racism has caused harm, but then I think there are a number of books and whatnot that I think that can give us as individuals or as designers kind of context on the ways in which racism impacts policy, impacts infrastructure. I think those are all good things to read. I can potentially share a list if that's helpful after this that can be shared out. And then I think one of the things that I think is, and it's not I guess I don't know if it's necessarily a thing that's learned, but I do believe that you have to be intentional about trying to identify the racist outcomes that I've talked about. So I mean, I think to me that's one of the most important things here, is kind of identifying those, and then in terms of your designers being able to kind of practice anti-racist design, I think later this year, hopefully soon, we as ChiByDesign will be kind of publishing anti-racist design mindsets and anti-racist design principles that we can also share with this group as people are trying to practice anti-racist design more broadly.
Awesome. Yeah, if you don't mind sharing that, I'm sure a lot of us would appreciate that. And that list that you mentioned earlier, in the meantime, that would be very, very helpful. Tony Moreno asks, would you consider equitable or inclusive design to be the same as anti-racist design, in such that they both attempt to be empathetic and considerate of marginalized groups, considering these of color and those with special needs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. First, I would say the anti-racist design is different than design for equity and design for inclusiveness, because like I mentioned before, the excuse me, in anti-racist design, we have to identify a group of people, a racial group, who have been harmed in order to design interventions to address racist outcomes, the racist outcomes that they've experienced. I think that when we think about equitable design, I think that's probably a bit more broad. But I will say too that, you know, we don't use the term kind of equitable design, and so I think I can speak for myself, but I think I can also speak for most of the folks on my team that you know, we don't believe that, you know, equity will necessarily truly be possible under capitalism, right? Because capitalism is a system in and of itself that is that, you know, that requires exploitation of people and of the planet, right? And so I don't believe that there can necessarily be true equity while we're under this system, but we can address racism, and we can design anti-racist interventions to address racist outcomes.
Perfect. Thank you. Austin asks, in order to co-design with folks, are there trust building exercises you did with your co-creators, and how do you approach the early stages of making connections? It's actually one of the questions I had too.
Yeah, I think that can come in, I guess, a number of different ways. So we practice in a couple of different ways. So we will, in some of the engagements that we do, they're kind of more workshop based. And so we'll work with folks, many times the same folks, over a number of weeks or months through a number of workshops. And so and in the many times in those workshops, there's folks who have been impacted by whatever the issue is that we're trying to address, and then also folks from the various systems that are related. But what we try to do is to take folks through kind of a number of exercises or collective experiences to kind of level the room and to kind of help us to kind of see each other as people, so we can then be you know, somewhat vulnerable in the space. But in terms of kind of our kind of longer term engagements, where we're co-designing with folks and we're bringing folks onto our teams for like the entire duration of an engagement, which may be, you know, 5 to 6 months, maybe over a year. We, as I mentioned before, kind of trained folks in design, but part of that process is us getting to know each other. And so we spend a significant amount of time. I wouldn't necessarily say we kind of do any like specific exercises, but we are very intentional about trying to develop relationships with folks before we get started in the work. So hopefully that was helpful.
Great. Thanks, Justin. Someone else asked, can you give an example of a specific product that was created through anti-racist design?
Yeah. So I guess I can give an example of one of the projects that we worked on in the kind of food system in Chicago. So we worked with Black and brown growers in Chicago and folks in the food system to identify to understand and identify the racist outcomes and the racist interactions that were happening in the system. And then we worked over a period of time to kind of co-create a set of strategies and principles that an organization could use to support Black and brown growers in the Chicago food system. And so kind of the result of that work was the community food navigator, which is now an organization that supports Black and brown growers in the Chicago food system. I guess, another I guess example might be we'll kind of go through do engagements, and we'll create concepts to support and I guess whatever issue that we're designing. And so, many of the things that we've concepts that we've designed kind of are kind of starting to be implemented by some of our clients. So we have a number that are being implemented also in kind of the Chicago City colleges as well. And so various programs and interventions that were designed to to support Black and brown students in that system as well.
Justin, when you say you supported a food growers, were these farmers in Chicago? And
yeah, so
okay.
some were growers in that way. Some are maybe growers that we wouldn't necessarily consider farms per se, but folks who grow and sell food products, right? And so it was those folks and your folks through that kind of work throughout the kind of food supply chain, if you think about it that way. So from the growers to the farmers markets or to the grocers, so kind of every kind of stage in between that process,
like the distribution stage. Okay. And then Nicole asked if you had any other great examples like the bridge that you shared of racist design.
I mean, I think I guess in terms of things things that we see, I think so that one was a bit more kind of infrastructural, I guess. But I mean, I would say most or everything around us is designed, right? I'm working on a project now where we're working to create better connections between incarcerated parents and their children. But when you think about or look at the kind of prison industrial complex, that is something that was designed, right? It may not be designed by designers, but it was something that was created with intention behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And that most definitely creates racist outcomes, right? When you look at the racial disparities and the folks who are in prison, right? So it's by and large people of color, and that's for a reason, right? So so when you think about this kind of larger design, there's practices that go into that. There are policies that go into that, right? But I look at that as a thing that has been designed.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. It's funny because I think about what other buildings, like even I'm in the DC area, and I think, the White House was built by slaves, and how was that racist at that time? I'm not a designer by trade, but the things that we see, but also the systems, as you've spoken to, that have been built and created. And as you suggested, it is our job as designers to really rethink and create or recreate those systems and processes, and not necessarily lean on what has been created for us, right? So Alice asked the question, what tips or strategies do you have for designers to identify racism that has been built in said processes or projects?
Tips. I Yeah, I'm trying to think of tips.
And I think that could be hard, like,
yeah, I think,
especially like for our allies, right? Those who are not a part of the marginalized group, how can we better educate ourselves to see it or understand it?
yeah, I think I would imagine, I think for folks of color, it may be easier to kind of inherently see and identify racism because we experience it. But I think in the way that we do in anti-racist design, I would imagine it would be the same for me or same for someone who wasn't a person of color. I think you have to, one, I mentioned before, know that racism does exist. But I think that that a lot of times the outcomes that we see, which are many times tangible, which are many times have been quantified, can point us to racism as kind of like and so in kind of looking for and looking at racial disparities as kind of a smoking gun, to then do more exploration to understand why the racial disparities exist. But I can't think of, I guess, any kind of tips off the top of my head. But I would suggest to try to in maybe doing research, try your best to read or view things from the perspectives of folks of color. And so maybe that's in research, kind of decentering some of the more academic research and turning to things maybe like Black Enterprise or Jet or Ebony or forums that highlight Black voices, or voices of folks of color, right? So you can kind of gain some additional perspective through kind of hearing or reading theirs.
And I think that speaks to your approach of co-design, right? So bringing in community advocates or leaders or, targeted groups, right? To help inform your design.
Yeah, and that's a good point too, right? And I think I was kind of talking more about the identify piece, but the kind of the piece around I guess researching, identifying things that you probably won't see, right? I think co-design helps, true co-design in the way that I've kind of described it to you, helps us to see some of those blind spots and some of those gaps that we might not see otherwise.
Right. So Mike McNeil asks, is your approach a more collaborative experience in co-design or a consulting approach when you're working with your clients?
We are collaborative, I guess, from a couple of different perspectives, right? So we work with our clients, and so we may establish kind of a group that would include clients, that would include other folks who have an interest in the issue or system that we're designing with, kind of as a group that kind of helps to kind of drive and understand the work. But then I would say the majority of our collaboration comes with the folks with lived experience who we're working with. And so our process in that way is completely collaborative, right? And so we don't kind of distinguish kind of folks who are kind of fully employed by ChiByDesign from folks who are employed by ChiByDesign as designers for a specific engagement, who may be folks with lived experience, right? And so we work together through, like I said before, through the entire engagement from start to finish, to to address racism. And one of the things that I kind of didn't share before, but this kind of gets back to this kind of power sharing that's necessary in the collaboration, is that when we design interventions as a group, the folks with lived experience on the team have the final say as to, is this the thing that we're going to be presenting to the clients as the proper intervention? Does this make sense? Is this the right intervention, right? And so I think that's an important piece. And so I think it's important to collaborate, but also important to kind of share power and shift power to the folks with lived experience that we're working with.
Great. And I know we only have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to squeeze in at least 1 or 2 more questions. Anti-racist design can be very consuming and taxing, especially when you collaborate with organizations who aren't ready to pivot. How do you bring folks into alignment or help your organization shift? Also, how do you maintain grounded? How do you maintain a healthy mindset and work-life balance, especially when you're dealing with trauma-informed design?
Yeah. So, I guess the first part of the question, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is how do we work with folks and organizations if they may not be, I guess, kind of as far along on their kind of anti-racist journey?
Yep.
Yeah, I think, people and organizations are in different places. We do our best to, we hold firm to our principles as a firm. And that's what drives us, but we also are willing to kind of bring folks along. And many times the folks who engage us are not where we are necessarily, but they're willing to kind of work and to learn to get there. Sometimes, folks may, be more pro anti-racism at the beginning than at the end, right? Because it causes you to have to kind of, admit some things at certain points, and to kind of change, and a lot of folks don't like change, right? But we are committed to training, right? So we'll many times train folks in the organizations that we work with, in the practice of anti-racist design and the practice of co-design. And then we will also so we have an anti-racist design assessment that we will offer to folks that we work with, to get a better understanding of kind of where they are, and then provide ways in which they can kind of grow in their journey. And then I know we're at time right now, so I think in terms of how I kind of manage kind of, I guess, my mental state and kind of work-life balance. I mean, I think for me, this work can be hard and heavy, but I just try to do things outside of outside of work that kind of bring some level of balance. You know, I mean, I don't, you know, we do have opportunities for like you know, counseling and things like that if folks on the team need it. You know, but I think it's for me, I try as much as possible to kind of like separate what I'm kind of thinking about and doing at work. And I try to set boundaries for myself. Whereas, you know, of course, things creep into personal life and your thoughts outside of 9 to 5. But I try to focus as much as I can on kind of my family, my son, and those kind of things after work. You know, so
Yeah,
you know, that's what I try to do.
very important. Okay, so I know we are at time. I do want to thank everyone for joining us, and special thank you to you, Justin, for your time and for your vulnerability and for sharing with us a little bit more about anti-racist design. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but if you do have further questions, feel free to reach out to me or connect directly with Justin. They are the subject matter experts. So I'm sure he and his team will be happy to answer any additional questions you may have. Also, if you are unaware, we are posting on our Instagram and LinkedIn today. Please join us on March 14th at Beats, Bites, and Backgrounds during the South by Southwest conference in Austin, Texas. So if you are local to that area, again, we welcome you to an amazing networking experience that's going on in downtown Austin on the 14th of March. So please follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram to learn more and reserve your spot. Again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us for another DID Network program. We really appreciate you. We will see you next quarter again. And again, special shout out to ChiByDesign. Have a great day, everyone, and happy Black History Month. Take care.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Justin.